Hey there, it's John from Heroes and Legends, and welcome to part 2 of our 6-part Amonkhet full set review. Today we're going to look at all of the blue cards. Now, if you joined us yesterday, we took a look at all of the white cards in the set, and as we continue through the week, we will get through every color and then wrap up with the multicolor and colorless. Quickly before we get started though, if you check out the description below, you'll find a couple ways to help support the channel, one of which is our Patreon page. We're actually really close to our next Patreon goal, so check that out if you get a chance. Secondly, you'll find our Amazon affiliate store. If you make any purchases from any Amazon seller via those links, a small percentage will come back to help support the channel. It really goes a long way, is always appreciated. Having said that, let's get into the cards for today. If you saw yesterday's video, you kind of know what to expect here. We're going to be looking at these cards first and foremost through a limited eye. We're looking at perhaps your sealed event for the pre-release, or if you're drafting these cards. And then beyond that, I'll discuss any card that has the possibility of seeing maybe some standard play and even some other formats like Modern or Commander occasionally. But our focus is going to be first and foremost the limited games. Having said that, let's get into the cards. And we're going to start off with Ancient Crab. I don't have a lot to say about this one. This is a fine limited card if you're playing a slower, more methodical controlling deck, or if you're up against an aggressive deck like a Rakdos or a red deck or something like that. I kind of like these spells a little better when they cost 2 and they're like 04s. They kind of do the same thing, but this is just fine if you need it in limited. Angler Drake. So the experiment continues. How much am I going to pay for a creature that bounces another creature? And we're up to 6. Am I going to pay it? Yeah, I'm still going to pay it. So first off, I want to point out this bounces a creature. It doesn't have to be opponent's creature. It can be yours. That will come into play some of the time. But most of the time, it's probably going to be your opponent's creature. And you're also getting a 4/4 flyer tacked onto this for 6 mana. It feels a little bit higher end curve, a little expensive, but I think the benefit is still strong enough even at 6 mana. And they're giving you enough of a good creature attached to it that I feel okay with it. So I do think this is actually first pickable in a lot of packs. This is a very high pick, very strong card for you in limited. Obviously a little too expensive for standard, but it's going to do a lot of work in either draft or sealed. Next we have As Foretold, and this one's a mythic, and we haven't seen a whole lot of powerful blue mythics in recent history, so it's kind of nice to see this. This could definitely get some competitive constructed play under its belt, I think. Let's talk about limited first. I think this is a fine play for you in limited. It's not as powerful as it will be in some constructed formats, and it's probably not for every limited deck, but if I think that I have a fair chance of keeping my hand stocked, for example, I have a lot of card draw spells and stuff like that in my deck, I think I could find some amazing value with this card because basically you're going to play this for 3. It's not going to do anything when it enters the battlefield. That's not going to feel super good. But as the next couple turns tick by, what your goal is to keep your hand stocked so that you can get to the point where you're basically playing 2 spells a turn and you just kind of overwhelm your opponent that way. That's where this card will really shine. Again, not for every deck in limited, and it's probably something that you might be able to draft around easier than, say, put into a sealed pool. But at the same time, this can be great in certain circumstances. Standard, I would love to see this in a control deck. Again, it's a little bit of an awkward play on turn 3 for a control deck. Maybe it's not a turn 3 play. Maybe they have to put it back a little bit so they can hold up their counter magic. But once they get it out and it starts accelerating with counters, it gets kind of crazy, especially in mirror matchups. So it does 2 things for those decks. First thing, it allows you to play your win condition without necessarily tapping out. That's kind of nice. And secondly, in a mirror, if you get into a counter spell matchup, well, good news, your first one's free. So even if it's on your opponent's turn, notice this is once each turn. So this can be your turn, and then you get to do it again on an opponent's turn. That's actually pretty awesome. I also like the fact that it's X or less, so it doesn't pigeonhole you into how many counters are actually on the card. Really, really versatile, fantastic card. And I do think it could even see some modern play. There's folks speculating right now due to its interaction with suspend cards. And you're seeing some spikes in a lot of classic suspend cards from the Time Spiral block due to the fact that this interacts incredibly well with them. So that could happen in Modern. It could also happen in Commander. So this is definitely a card that I think will be really popular. Haven Initiate. Not too much to say about this one. It's a very playable, limited card. Middle of the pack, maybe draft 3/2. So it does have evasion with flying, which is nice. And it has Embalm, so it can come back. I think it's a nice package for 4 mana. All right, next we have Cancel, which of course is a reprint, originally from Time Spiral, but printed a whole lot of times over the years. I always felt like this was kind of an attempt to fix Counterspell, but Counterspell, at least in some formats, was almost like too powerful for 2 blue, where Cancel was not powerful enough a lot of the time for 2 blue and 1. And what's awkward about this is, in the last couple blocks, we've been giving Cancels with upsides. And I think those are better designed cards, quite honestly. I think Cancel with upside becomes playable, where Cancel isn't always playable, if that makes sense. Now, for limited purposes, this is very playable. Like, you can get this in your seal pool and be happy with it. You can even draft this sometimes in the middle of a pack and find some value there. And it's going to be just fine, especially in blue. Blue doesn't have a lot of ways to get rid of creatures that already exist or get rid of problems that already exist on the board. So counter magic is sometimes the way they go about it. And this is going to be great for you there. As far as standard goes, at least at this point, until some other things rotate out of the format, I just really don't see this getting play because there's just better versions of Cancel out there right now. Cartouche of Knowledge. So I talked about the cartouches at great length yesterday, so I don't want to rehash a lot of that. But I will say, at least this one in particular, I like it. It's a 2 casting cost card that replaces itself. So that way, if I get 2 for 1, it doesn't feel horrible. And its interaction with the trials makes it that much better. So the trials, especially the blue trial, it's actually a real good one. We'll see that one in a little bit. I wouldn't want to go overboard with these in limited, but maybe running a trial or 1 or 2 of these, it will be pretty good as a support mechanism to your limited deck. Censor. I talked about this at length actually when it was first revealed. It's an interesting card. There's pros and cons to it. It's a fair enough counterspell. Here's what's a little awkward though. Force Spike, Mana Tithe, the reason those cards were so good is because a lot of times players just didn't play around 1 open mana. You have to have 2 open mana for this one to work, and there's at least another major counterspell in the set we're going to look at in a few moments that costs a blue and 1. So it's going to kind of signal to your opponent that you may have something. It's a good card to bluff around if you don't have. At least pretend you have it. You actually get more value, I think, from this card pretending you have it than actually having it, which is kind of funny. But at the same time, the pro to the card is the fact that you can cycle it away. Many times, Mana Tithe or Force Spike type abilities aren't great later in the game. Your opponent has like 12 lands, and they're not going to tap out, and you're just stuck with this card. It's basically a dead draw. Well, now you can cycle it away. It's fair enough that I think in limited, it's still very playable. Maybe not a high pick. You might be able to pick one of these up a little bit later in the pack, but I think it can still sometimes make your deck. As far as standard goes, it might see a little play out of sideboards. I don't think it's going to be a card that you're going to see aggressively put into control decks, but maybe a 1 or 2 of there just to keep your opponent guessing out of the sideboard. Next we have the blue split card, Commit to Memory, and I don't mind the commit side so much. I think it's fine in limited. It's a nice little tempo play. It's going to take a spell on the stack or a non-land permanent, so I like the versatility there. And it's going to put it into its owner's library second from the top. Now, that could include your stuff, so if you're trying to protect something of yours that's important to you, you could play it on your own thing. It tempos you a little bit, but if you don't have a better option, then it could be okay for you. The card brings a lot of versatility, and I do like that. The one thing that's a little awkward is I usually like these type of effects when they put something on top of the opponent's library, because sometimes you can keep them off a land or something like that a little longer. This lets them see another new card before the old card comes back. That's a tad awkward, but it's not a deal breaker for me. The memory side, I'm not super excited about. I mean, look at it this way. It's just a bonus stapled on. So if you play commit in your limited deck, then you have memory if you ever needed it. It's just not very exciting. Simply, it's Time Twister for 6. The biggest problem with that is when you Time Twist in the limited environment, or even say the standard environment, you're not going to be drawing like crazy broken cards like you are in Vintage or Power Cube, where Time Twister really shines, right? You're going to be drawing a lot of fair magic cards, and you're basically giving your opponent first crack. Much like Days Undoing, which ended your turn. This one doesn't end your turn, but it might as well, because you're paying 6 for it. So at that point, your opponent's going to basically get first crack. They're going to put down their stuff first. You're going to be on the defensive, and it's just not going to be good for you. The one possible utility for the memory side is you're in a matchup where your opponent's got a ton of great value in their graveyard, a bunch of aftermath spells that you can't deal with, or maybe some embalmed creatures, and you really are left no choice but to trigger this to clear their graveyard. Still doesn't put you in a great position, unfortunately, but maybe it lets you stabilize a little bit, perhaps. So it is what it is. Like I said, if you just think of it as an extra piece to commit, then it doesn't feel bad, but just be careful, it can be a trap. Compelling argument. Now, there really isn't like a mill strategy in this limited game, but this is all about really milling yourself most of the time. Not to say it can't come into play the other way around sometimes, but for the most part, this is about filling your graveyard with things. And especially if you're playing colors that are going to have a lot of embalm in them, or even just aftermath spells, if you have a number of the multicolor ones or something like that, this can help you find some additional value. It's almost like drawing cards when you hit the right things. However, it also lets you cycle it away, which is nice when you're at a point in the game where that's not applicable anymore. Next is Cryptic Serpent. This is a fine limited beater. I mean, there's nothing super exciting about this. It's going to be better probably in some draft decks than sealed decks because you may have some more instants and sorceries in those type of decks. But regardless, most of the time, unless you're in a really strong Is It Spell style build, which doesn't seem as intuitive in this set as it has in other sets, and you'll see what I'm talking about in a few minutes here. But if you're in that build, this card gets a little bit better. But you know what? Even if I have 1 or 2 instants or sorceries that I'm able to play, casting this for 6 or for 5 actually is quite fair. It doesn't have evasion or anything. This isn't going to be a card that crosses over into standard as a control finisher or anything like that. But it is a solid card, I think, in a lot of limited builds. Curator of Mysteries. Now, here's a really good card. A 4/4 for 4 with flying. That is very aggressive, and that's what I was alluding to a moment ago. This is the first of a few cards we're going to see today that have a real strong aggressive edge in blue, and that's rare. You don't see that a lot. In fact, we haven't seen that, at least in strong quantities, probably since like Magic 2011, Magic 2012, like that time period. So this is an interesting take on blue, and I actually kind of like it. It's going to play a little differently this time with red, I think, where it's going to feel a lot more aggressive. It will still have a good spell backup, and maybe some burn and stuff like that, and counter magic, but it also has a nice aggressive edge to it. Cards like this definitely bring that out of the color. So where does this see play? This is definitely first pickable in draft. This is a phenomenal limited card. It's doing so much for you. Not to mention, it's got amazing stats with evasion, but it also has cycling tacked on if you stumble on mana, and it has the extra ability that could let you scry a few times over the course of the game. Very, very good. Power level wise, this could see some standard play too. Now it is competing with another very good control finisher, which we're going to look at in a few moments, but I do think this could see a little bit of play at some point somewhere, although I'm not exactly sure which deck that will be yet. But overall, great card. Decision Paralysis. Not a whole lot to say about it. Like, running one of these in limited is just fine for you. It's a nice tempo play. Sometimes it will let you get a little more aggressive, which this blue is definitely interested in doing. Get some more damage across. But ultimately, what's a little disappointing about this card is we've seen the same effect cheaper in the past. But it is what it is. This is what we got this time around. Drake Haven. I like this card a lot. Now, I'm usually not a big fan of 3-drop enchantments that don't do anything on their own. This is very contingent on you being able to cycle or discard and then pay extra mana. But if you even make a couple Drake tokens, that might be good enough in a lot of limited games to just simply pull ahead or win the game. So because of that, I'm willing to roll the dice on this card. Obviously, this card gets much better as long as I have a lot of cycling. So maybe a blue-black cycling style deck could really see a lot of value here in a draft. And potentially this is first pickable and you pick it up and just try to build around it. But maybe more likely you pick up some good cycling cards in pack 1, you open this in pack 2 and you decide to go all in on that plan. That's a lot of times where you're going to find yourself when you get this card, I think. So standard, can't see play there. Again, it's a little conditional on other things going your way and going right. But it is a powerful effect too. I wouldn't count it out. I just don't really know for sure where it falls in. I don't know if a control deck wants this because I don't necessarily think they want to cycle away too many of their cards or pay the extra mana. But 2/2 flyers, especially with a control backup, could be powerful. It'd be at least something I'd want to test, I think. Essence Scatter. Well, I alluded to this one a little bit earlier, but this is another reprint, and this is a very fine counterspell for creatures for just 2 mana, a blue and 1. So again, opponents are going to have to be very cognizant when you have a blue and 1 other land untapped in this format, and they're going to have to be really, really careful. And this is a great card. It's seen standard play in the past. it will see standard play again. Even if it's out of sideboards, this is a phenomenal card. Next we have Floodwaters, and this is fine as a one-of. I think in a lot of limited builds, you'll be happy to run this. It's not something you want to pick early, but you'll probably be able to pick one of these up late in a draft and be just happy with it. It's a little expensive, but you can cycle it away if you stumble on mana. And again, it's doing something that blue kind of wants to do in this set, and it allows you to get super aggressive. Now, there's also versatility built in here. You don't have to bounce 2 of your opponent's creatures. Notice the wording. You could bounce 2 of your own, 1 of each. So there's a lot of different scenarios where this can maybe do some unique things if you need it to, but a lot of the times it's just going to be a tempo play to allow you to get in some extra damage, maybe even win a game here and there. Gale Strike. I'm not usually a big fan of these return the tapped creature to their owner's hands cards, but blue does have a lot of decent counter magic this time around, and sometimes you can bounce something that you weren't able to deal with earlier in the game, and you have a counter answer to it now. So I think this is good in conjunction with some counter magic. It's not going to make your cut all the time. It is uncommon, so there's going to be a few of these going around in a draft. I wouldn't be opposed to maybe playing one. It does replace itself. I do like that a whole lot. It's definitely not a card that I see crossing over into any sort of standard control. There's just better stuff out there. But maybe one of these is sometimes playable depending on what other options you have in limited. Glyph Keeper. Now this is the other finisher I was talking about earlier. This is actually pretty awesome. Now I joked when this card was originally revealed that this card does not want to see 2/3/3 flyers sitting across it on the battlefield, and that's probably its biggest weakness. However, if you play this in a control build and you have ways to remove those creatures or stop them from entering the battlefield to begin with, this card is really, really hard for your opponent to deal with. If they try to lightning bolt it, the first one gets countered, so they're going to need 2 removal spells. That gets really difficult to do, especially if you have some counter backup to protect this thing. It's really hard to deal with, and even if your opponent gets to deal with it, it's got Embalm. If it goes to the graveyard, you can bring it back for, it's a little expensive, but still for 7 mana, and control decks can easily swing that typically. So having said that, limited, yeah, this is easily first pickable. This thing is really hard to deal with. It's a fantastic card. Standard, I think this will be the control finisher for a lot of decks out there. In a lot of ways, it's even better in standard when you have a lot of different ways to protect it and keep the path clear, as opposed to even limited, where it's a great card, but could still run into some problematic combat situations more often. But really good for control standard decks, no doubt. Hegbus Sentinels. Well, here's another card that's kind of borderline aggressive. Whenever you cycle or discard, it gets +1/+1 until end of turn. It's a 2/3 for 3. Very unusual. Now, we have seen some 2/3 prowess cards, sometimes in blue, that type of thing. This kind of feels like those cards, and a lot of times you find a little bit of value from them in limited. And notice this is a common. You might be able to pick one of these up a little bit later in a pack and find some value, and it actually makes one of your 3 spots. Hieroglyphic Illumination. It's an instant card draw spell, which I'm all for. I mean, that's phenomenal. The casting cost is a little funny to me because I can pay a blue and 3 and cycle this and draw a card, or I can pay a blue and cycle this. So I'm actually paying 3 for that extra card. That feels expensive, but you know what? It's instant card draw. I'm going to play it. I'm going to be real happy with it, quite honestly. Very playable, obviously, in limited games, both sealed and draft, and it's a common. There'll be a fair amount of these showing up even in some drafts, so that's kind of good. And also, in standard, I do think we'll cross over into some of the control decks. Illusory Wrappings. Now, blue doesn't always have a lot of good ways to deal with things on the battlefield, other than counter magic, stopping it from getting there, or tempo plays by bouncing it and stuff of that nature. But this card is a quasi-answer. It's kind of your best option for blue quote-unquote removal. So if you need it, it's there for you. Now, the power of blue really comes into play when it's partnered with, say, black or red or something like that, that has answers, or even white with some of its O-ring pacifism-style answers. That's when blue can really excel. But if you don't have a lot of good options in those departments, then maybe you play this card in limited and you're okay with it. Next we have Kefnet the Mindful. This is a mythic, this is the blue god, and I actually like this card quite a bit. When I first saw it, I was a little shaky on it because I was a little hung up on the whole, it's going to be hard to get 7 cards in my hand to make this thing attack. But you know what? Who cares? If this thing was an enchantment instead of blue and 2, and then pay a blue and 3 to draw a card, and you can, if you want, return a land to your hand, I'd be on board. Like, this would be a fantastic card. It would be a first pickable draft card, quite honestly. And the gravy on top is that maybe every once in a while I might be able to attack in with a 5/5 indestructible flyer. Yeah, sign me up. This is a fantastic card. It's a late game mana sink that lets you draw cards, and every once in a while it can go aggro and attack or block if you need to. Also, too, it's a attacking deterrent. Even if you don't have 7 cards in your hand, if you have some open mana, you could potentially get to 7, and your opponent's got to think twice about attacking in. So it does slow the game down that way as well. Now for standard, it's a little awkward in some ways because the control deck may want this card. It really likes the card draw, but ultimately if they want to attack with it and use it as a finisher, they have a weird tug-of-war sort of decision to make. They either have to make sure they can keep their hand stocked with other spells that are drawing cards, or they're going to, at some point, maybe have to return a land to their hand, and control decks don't necessarily want to do that, or at least not too frequently. So they do have to be careful with that they don't go too far with that particular mechanic. But the power levels there, I feel like this could show up in some control decks, maybe as a 1 of or 2 of. I wouldn't be shocked at all to see that. Labyrinth Guardian, well, here's another one of those more aggressively costed blue cards, this time a 2/3 for 2. Now, its drawback being that if it's targeted with a spell, you do have to sacrifice it, but notice it's not spell or ability. A lot of the phantom cards from the past were taken away with a spell or ability. This one is just a spell, so that's a lot harder to pull off, and sometimes even impossible in a limited game when your opponent has a very creature-heavy deck. Now, it also has a bomb on top of that, so if your opponent does deal with it, you're able to bring it back for 4 mana. That's actually not too bad. Another super aggressive card, and it makes me really want to try out maybe an Is It build that focuses on more aggressive creatures. Lay Claim. This one's a little expensive at 7, but its effect is huge, and it mitigates that extra expense with cycling. So if you stumble and you can't hit this card, you can cycle it away. That's a big deal, to be honest with you. Now, if you don't stumble and you can play this on like turn 7 or 8, this can be a huge swing. These control magic style cards are always very good, and this one actually hits any permanent. So that includes lands, artifacts, planeswalkers, creatures, you name it. That's actually kind of awesome. It makes me feel like it's sort of worth the 7 mana. I think this is actually first pickable. This is a very, very strong card. It's at uncommon, so it will show up periodically in drafts. Definitely one to keep an eye out for. It can swing a game really effectively. I do think it might be a little too overcosted for standard, even though it does have a huge effect. Naga Oracle. I actually like this card a lot. This is a common. You might be able to pick this up like a little bit later in a pack and draft, but you'll be happy to play this, I think. A 2/4 for 4 is just fine. It's a nice blocker. It slows the game down a little bit. But the fact that you get a little bit of card selection by looking at the top 3 cards and then choosing basically which ones you want to put in your graveyard, and then out of the ones you keep, what order they go on top of your library, that's phenomenal for so many reasons. I mean, it lets you sift out lands if you're getting mana flooded. It lets you throw Aftermath or Embalm cards into your graveyard to get extra value there. Make sure you keep drawing some heat on the top of your library. I really like this card, actually. I think this is a very strong common in limited. New Perspectives, a very fine draw card for limited. I'd be really happy to play this. I'm not necessarily first picking this, but I do think it could be a high pick in some packs. And yeah, you know what? 6 mana, I'll cycle a card and draw 2 more. I'm on board with that. That's fine with me. It has a secondary ability too, which every once in a while could come into play. If it does, wonderful, but I'm not even too concerned about that. I'm just happy with the first one. A little too expensive for standard. There's just going to be more effective card draw spells, as we're going to see in a few moments. Open into Wonder. This is an aggressive blue sorcery. 2 blue and X, and you get to say, X of my creatures, you can't block them this turn. Oh, and by the way, they all have Curiosity, so I'm going to draw a bunch of cards too. That's kind of awesome. A lot of times this will put away a game for you, I think, but if it doesn't, it kind of still is putting away a game by letting you draw a whole bunch of cards. It is a little conditional on board state. I mean, if you're behind and you draw this card and you can't attack in with everything because you could die to the crackback, of course, it's going to be bad for you there. And that's kind of sad. There's a little bit of variance to this card you do have to take into account. However, if you're ahead or you're in a board stall, this thing could simply end a game for you. I'd like it a whole lot. Enough to first pick it in a lot of packs, I think. Fantastic card for limited. A little too situational for standard, but great in limited. Pull from Tomorrow. Now, this is the card I've been alluding to. This is perhaps one of the best draw spells we've seen in absolute years. This is phenomenal. 2 blue and X, instant, draw X cards and discard a card. And I'll tell you right now that discard a card does not have to be a drawback. In Standard, we have things like Madness, for example. Not to mention just in Limited, even Aftermath and Bomb. You can find value from a lot of things in your graveyard that you could toss in there. So aside from all that, this is just an incredible card draw spell. Limited, first pickable, fantastic card to restock your hand at instant speed at the end of your opponent's turn. In Standard, this is the engine control decks needed to go from really, really good to great. This is the Sphinxs Revelation they have been missing. They have it now. This is going to propel those decks easily into top tier. This card could even see some Modern play. Now, granted, there's other card draw spells out there in Modern, but this one is still very solid, and I have no doubt this will see a lot of Commander play in the future, too. River Serpent. This is okay in Limited. It's not always going to make your cut. The thing that makes me say that it's probably playable is the fact that it's cycling, because there are times when a 5/5 with no evasion that you might not even be able to attack with isn't going to be super great for you for 6 mana, but some decks will be okay running this, especially if you're looking for a good blocker and you're not concerned about being able to attack with this right away, or concerned that maybe your opponent can chump block it with 1/1 tokens or something like that, then you can still play it and it'll be fine. It will be a late pickup. Maybe it makes your playables a portion of the time, and that's kind of all there is to it. Sacred Excavation. This can be okay for you, again, if you have a lot of cycling cards. Maybe, again, you're in blue-black cycling or something like that in draft. In that case, this is a decent pickup. Maybe play one of these for a little additional value. Scribe of the Mindful. This is, again, okay if you're going to be dumping a lot of stuff in your graveyard, and this particular limited environment does allow you to do that. What's a little disappointing about this card, though, is just how slow it is. I don't mind the 3 casting costs for a 2/2. I don't mind having to activate it for 1 mana. I don't even mind sacrificing it. What really bothers me is tapping it. It just slows the card way, way down. Pretty much takes it out of contendership for a card that you could see in Standard or even Modern. Without the tap ability, this could even see some Modern play. Unfortunately, the way it stands now, I think it's just basically a limited card, and not even for every limited build. Seeker of Insight. Now, this is a looter, but it does have a drawback that you cannot actually loot with it unless you've already cast a non-creature spell this turn. I don't think that's that bad of a drawback, though, quite honestly. Now, it's not as good as classic looters that you can just use whenever you want, but we don't have those. So we have this, and the fact of the matter is, I don't think it's super difficult to turn on. Remember, you can do this not only in your turn, but also your opponent's turn. So if you play a counterspell, or maybe one of those instant draw spells, then you get a chance to loot on their turn, at the end of their turn, maybe. So that's actually pretty awesome. And then on your turn, if you play a sorcery, or you play an artifact or something like that, you could loot on your turn. So I think it's easy enough to turn on. It's a decent blocker, too, for 2 mana as a 1/3. So I actually think this is highly pickable in draft, maybe even first pickable in certain packs. I think the power level is actually here for this card, and a lot of people might overlook it because of the drawback. So it's definitely one to keep an eye on, and it's common, so you should be able to find these relatively easily. As a matter of fact, I think it's so good that this could see a little bit of Standard play. I think there's decks that are going to be casting enough instants and sorceries and stuff like that, that the drawback isn't going to be much of a drawback for them. Shimmer Scale Drake, fine limited card. I don't have a whole lot to say about this one. I like that it has cycling in case I stumble on mana, but if not, it's a nice little flyer. Slither Blade, another aggressive blue card. This is a 1-drop 1/2 that can't be blocked. That's kind of amazing, especially considering this is at common. You can maybe get a few multiples of these. Again, if you're playing an aggressive build, like an Is It aggressive deck, or even some of the aggressive black cards combined with some of the aggressive blue cards here, could have something interesting on your hands in draft, and this could be a part of that. Todd Crop Skirmisher. Another aggressive card. This one's costed as a 2-drop 2/1, and it has Embalm for 4, so you can bring it back. It's going to trade up some of the time with maybe some 3/2s that are 3-drops, and again, it just puts the pressure on your opponent in blue, something that's very unusual. Trial of Knowledge. Well, I mentioned this one a little bit earlier, but this is actually a very good trial, and if you have a Cartouche or 2 in your deck to get extra value out of this, even better. Drawing 3 cards, again, you discard 1. Like I mentioned earlier, that's not always a drawback in this particular set either. So I do think this will be a very high pickable card and may encourage you to pick up a cartouche or two later on in the pack, which I think those should be relatively easy to get as commons. As far as standard goes, could even see a little bit of standard play perhaps. Now, the fact that you really unlock the true value of this card with cartouches puts it back maybe a little bit for standard play, but it's at least possible. I'd like to kind of see how the meta unfolds first, but I think it's got a chance. Vizier of Many Faces. This is a card that's probably more relegated again to limited, but I think it's a good limited card. I think this could be highly pickable in draft, and it's a clone. I mean, clones are good in limited. A lot of times they're not as good in standard because they're a little too conditional on board state, but this one is a clone with Embalm, so hey, why not? This is going to be a real good creature for you under a lot of circumstances. Vizier of Tumbling Sands. This is a creature that has cycling, so that's definitely worth noting. Also, too, it untaps another permanent. Not just creature, but permanent. So you can untap a land for some extra value, or you can untap an exert creature. Now, you don't see a lot of blue exert creatures, obviously, or any, but there are a lot of exert creatures in other colors, so they combo well with those creatures. This is another fair card that I wouldn't mind playing. It costs 3. It's still a nice little blocker, though. Might not always make your build, but I think it's good. And even if you have to cycle it, you do get a little value. Maybe you get to untap one of your exert cards, for example, is a one-time thing. Winds of Rebuke. Very fair, very easy to cast tempo spell. It's a non-land permanent. It's not just creature, and it only costs 2 mana. And it's instant, so there's a lot of good stuff in this card. I could see this actually being relatively highly pickable. Now, the quote-unquote drawback is each player puts 2 cards from his or her library into their graveyard. Now, again, in blue, there's a lot of times that that's going to be good for you, but you don't know what your opponent's playing. It could help your opponent, too. I guess that's where the high variance comes in. But you know what? For 2 mana at instant speed, dealing with non-land permanent, I'm fine with it. I'll take the risk. I think that's more than good enough. The variance might keep it out of standard because there's other things they can be doing there, but still very fine in draft or sealed. Zenith Seeker. And this is okay if I know I have a lot of cycling or discard in my deck. If I do, I'll probably run this and be happy with it. If I don't feel like I'm going to be able to trigger the ability very frequently, then I'm probably skipping this one unless I'm really desperate for something with evasion. 2/2 flyer for 4, it has to have a really good ability, and I have to have a deck that I feel like the ability is going to be able to be turned on frequent enough for me to play this. Having said that, those are all of the blue cards. So tomorrow we're going to be back. We're going to look at all of the black cards and so on and so forth as we make it through the week, hopefully helping you out as we get closer to the pre-release. Now, of course, when we look at these cards and I evaluate them, I mean, these are just my opinions. A lot of folks have different play styles and stuff. So, I mean, play what makes you happy and that you enjoy playing, or use different mechanics that you think are fun. Ultimately, that's what pre-release is all about at the end of the day. And I'm not going to be right about everything. You may find something that definitely you disagree with, and that's totally cool. But yeah, that's the fun of Magic. I think that's what makes this game as complicated and as fun to sit down and play as it is. So until next time, hey, thanks for watching. Please remember to like and subscribe, and have a great day. Hey, thanks for watching. This video is made possible by the generous support of viewers like you on Patreon. Check out the description below for links to our Patreon page as well as our Amazon affiliate store, where a small percentage of all sales will also help support the channel. Finally, if you haven't had a chance yet to subscribe, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any new videos on Heroes and Legends. Talk to you again soon, and have a great day.